Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Priyamvada Natarajan. I'm an astrophysicist with strong intellectual interests in the history and philosophy of science, and I serve as the current director of Yale's flagship interdisciplinary Franke program in science and the humanities. It's my absolute pleasure today to start this wonderful event by first recognizing our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Franke. Thanks to their generosity, this program and many other initiatives at Yale have benefited from their vision to foster scholarship that breaks disciplinary boundaries and generates radical new lenses to view the world through. Meanwhile, before we start today's event, I am required to give you this notice. This event is being recorded and photographed for educational, archival, and promotional purposes, including use in print on the internet and other forms of media. By attending this event today, you agree to the possibility of your voice or your likeness captured by these means and used for such purposes without compensation to you, and hereby waive any related right to privacy or publicity. So before I introduce our fantastic speaker this evening, let me remind you that we have a reception upstairs after the talk in the student lounge immediately after the event. So you're all invited to please come join us. There's some really yummy food there. So now on to today's event. I can promise you it'll be a real treat. This evening we are gathered for a book talk by one of our own, the incredible mind whom we are fortunate to have on our faculty at Yale, Professor Jing Tsu. Professor Tsu, the John M. Schiff Professor of East Asian Languages and Literatures and Comparative Literature at Yale, is a cultural historian, literary scholar of modern China at Yale University. The first tenured professor appointed in East Asian languages and literatures and comparative literature, her research spans literature linguistics, science and technology, internationalization, regionalism, and globalization, and US-China relations. She's a member and former chair, 2014 to 2021, of the Council on East Asian Studies and a senior research fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies and an affiliate faculty at the Jackson School of Global Affairs. Professor Tsu has written for the New York Times Book Review, the Financial Times, and has authored or co-edited 5 books. Her most recent book, which is what we're going to be hearing about today, Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern, was named among the 100 notable books of 2022 by the New York Times and the best nonfiction of 2022 list in the Washington Post. It's been reviewed extensively. Pretty much every major publication has reviewed it across the world, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the New Yorker, Economist, Wired, Science, Nature, The Guardian, Times Literary Supplement, London Review of Books, and the South China Morning Post, and of course the NRC in Holland and the Frankfurter Allgemeine in Germany. This book tells the story of how China and its language entered the information age, dominated by the Western alphabet. In spring 2023, Jing Tsu is delivering Yale's William Clyde Devane Lectures, China in 6 Keys. Jing is widely recognized for her original approach, interdisciplinary synthesis, and perspective on China. She has held fellowships and honors from multitude of places, including the Society of Fellows at Harvard, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, New Directions Fellowship from the Mellon Foundation, and the Institute for Advanced Study and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. I don't need to tell you that she's an extremely distinguished scholar whose work we are really excited to hear more about. Before we start the event, and I invite Jing to the stage, I want to mention a couple of our ongoing projects and upcoming events. So we have a Learning by Doing project, which is we are collecting little simple science videos of little experiments that can be done at home for children from around the world who can do little experiments just to fulfill their curiosity. So if you would like to be a contributor and send in a video, please go ahead and take a look at our website. We would be delighted. The next announcement I want to make, quick one, is next Wednesday at 4 p.m. we have a film screening of The Lost Leonardo, followed by a post-film moderated discussion with Diane Modestini, the famed art conservator whose restoration work actually led to the discovery of the artwork and was critical in establishing that it was a Leonardo. So, yeah, please mark your calendars next Wednesday at 4 p.m. And on Tuesday, April 18th, we have another wonderful book talk by one of our own, Professor Beverly Gage, who will be talking to us about her recent book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. And on April 26th, we carry A World Within Us, Cellular Structures That Allow Us to Live in a Very Hostile Environment. I want to often read out these because to show you how interdisciplinary the offerings are. So please mark your calendars, and I look forward to seeing you at many of these events. So it's a particular pleasure for me, as Jing also happens to be a close friend. So without further ado, Jing, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Priya. I have to first thank the Franke program for having me today. I'm not sure if any talk I can deliver can live up to that very generous introduction from Priya. But as you know, we're friends. In any case, it's a delight to be here. I feel that is long overdue since the book came out a year ago. And I thank also Alice Kaplan, Director of Humanities Center last year, Whitney Humanities Center, who invited me to come speak. So today, as I've given a lot of talks on this book, I thought I'd share with you here, in some ways, the paths that led me to it. That's why it's called Behind Kingdom Characters in some ways, and I'll take you through this particular thread in the book. There's really 3 points of genesis, and one actually brings me back to my roots as a literary scholar. As a student of modern Chinese literature, any student will have read all the writings, if not most, by this man, Hu Shi. He was a proponent of using vernacular speech to replace the elite literary classical Chinese in the early 20th century. This was a movement that really revolutionized in modern China because it gave language back to the people, the power of literacy. And this was really the beginning of it. But of all the things that you would read by Hu Shi, there's this one here that's often unnoticed. And it took me years until I embarked on this book to realize that all the evidence and the cues were there. I just didn't quite see it when I was strictly a student of literature. So this is a preface that he wrote to this scheme on Chinese characters, which I will talk about in a bit. And he talks about, of all things, not vernacular versus elite language, but the idea of organization. And he says here, order is to find a logical thread in chaos. And here he's actually commenting on this immense task that Chinese were faced with in the early 20th century. How do they actually preserve and hold on to the written heritage, given that there's an onslaught of westernization and a pressure modernization that was basically making old knowledge seem old and unpopular and very kind of calcified. But then when he talks about this, he said, what's really important, the hard task is really this very pedestrian, very mundane thing to do, which is to make sure that you can find things where you find them. And that is tedious for sure. And he talks about how this is really kind of like a service industry part of modern Chinese literature. That there's going to be people who will have to do it, and they will be like the saviors and martyrs for literature. But of course, not Hu Shi himself, although he will support them. And he said people who engage in this kind of painstaking labor do it so that other people don't have to. And so regardless, oh, sorry, I'm not sure why this just fell out. Is it coming up? Great, sorry. Now you see what I'm reading from. So, sorry for the momentary blindness. So regardless of what people do, the scholarly world is utterly indebted to them. So it's this group of people that I got very interested in. Who is this invisible community that managed to carry modern Chinese literature, the very language that made up literature, on their backs, but who went utterly unrecognized? And as Hu Shi said, they're basically doomed to anonymity. So that was my first thread right there, my first clue. And I tucked this away in my mind. And about 10 years ago, when I was working into the history of science and technology, I decided to educate myself by reading Joseph Needham's, this very famous seminal works by Joseph Needham called The Science and Civilization in China. It's about 26 volumes. Don't worry, I didn't get through all of them. 26 volumes, and Joseph Needham was a towering figure. And in 1956, in volume 2, he made these references in footnotes about the Chinese language. And you can see that this is where this towering mind at the time, he had doubts about the fundamental task he was undertaking, which was to justify, to explain how China had always had science and technology, right? To refute the fact that just because the scientific revolution took place in the West doesn't mean that China didn't have their own accomplishments, scientific and technological. But he had a doubt when it came to the language. And he said, he will quote other people in these footnotes and say, well, some people say that something about the Chinese language that hampers their thinking, right? That kind of skews the way or limits the way or charts a particular way of thinking because of the character ideographic writing system they had. But clearly he had doubts because he did not put that in the main body. And there was yet another footnote that says, well, Chinese seem particularly well positioned to think combinatory logic by virtue of the fact that character writing are made of parts rather than alphabetic letters that kind of in a linear rollout. So that was my second clue. And I kind of wonder about that. Is it true at the time? Is it true that alphabetical thinking, the alphabetic mind, in some ways was more amenable to modernization? Was it more superior? Was it more accessible? Was it easier than ideographic thinking or thinking in the Chinese character language? And of course, when I looked into the literature, the scholarship, the history that had been written in my field, it wasn't very helpful because whenever we talk about Chinese language, it was very much cast in a frame of superiority versus inferiority, the inferiorization of Chinese language and culture, and the way that we pit them as primitive or more backwards, as opposed to Western civilization, right? Which is actually a relatively recent hierarchy that happened in the 19th century with the evolution. And so I looked in other places, hoping that there were other disciplines that could give me a clue. And this was around 2015, where I then came across a subfield in neuroscience, which was to study the neuroscience of reading. So writing system, we might not think about this, is actually very young. It basically developed within a blink of an eye in the larger sweep of evolution, right? About 5,000 years, 5,500 years old. So it's not really possible that evolutionarily we could have adapted, our brains could have adapted so quickly that we have a particular set of neurons that just deal with writing. So it turns out they're built on a prior infrastructure of pattern recognition, of identifying, where the horizon meets, where there are intersections in the roads. You will also know that when you look out in the expanse of the ocean, you don't normally, you normally fix your gaze somewhere, right? So that's what we're kind of fine-tuned for evolutionary purposes, so that we can find our way home after we, hit that tiger over the head or deer. We try to carry it back to our caves. So it makes a lot of sense. And it took me to Marina Del Rey to visit a neuroscientist who were the first to talk about pattern recognition and the visual image processing, Erwin Biedermann, whom I was sad to find out just the other day that he passed away in 2022. And so this train of thought then led me down another rabbit hole. Because it turns out, according to neuroscientists, there are different ways and different startup costs for reading the alphabet or reading ideographic writing. But eventually, it all comes out pretty much the same, right? Literacy and literacy. We learn to accustom and to connect patterns in such a way that they become conventionalized and internalized, and that's when we read them. So this is kind of bottom line, but I was still not quite satisfied. So what is it about the Chinese language that's been that's so mystified for centuries, that baffled the Western missionaries since the 16th century, that have given rise to accusations and assumptions of inferiority, of what held the Chinese back in the 20th century, so on and so forth. And the criticism was not just coming from Westerners themselves, but also the Chinese. They too came to see, mainly because of their interaction with the Western alphabet, how cumbersome, in some ways, how unfriendly the Chinese language was to modernity. So it was my goal then to set out to prove or to figure out, is that really true? And if so, why? And there's also a more direct route to this, because when I was working on my last book in 2010, Sound and Script in Chinese Diaspora, one of my favorite writers, Lin Yutang, turned out his lifelong passion was to build a Chinese typewriter. At the time, I didn't know what to make of this, and quite disappointed, of course, as a student of literature. You imagine these writers just lock themselves away in an attic and to, listen to their muse and write away. But he had a very mechanical and engineer-like mind. And so I flagged it in this chapter called Lin Yutang's Typewriter, and I vowed that I would come back to it. And so hence, about a decade later, after going through many other, digressions and detours and many, many archives and delving deep into this and talking to many people in industry, because that's what this project took, and that's where we are now. So let me just go back to this. You will see that the footnote is from an article that Hu Shi wrote. I mentioned that's a preface. It's a preface to something called the four-corner index system. And it's by a man, Wang Yunwu, who was not alone in this endeavor. So what this meant was, when Hu Shi talked about organization, just as in the alphabet, you see in dictionaries, that's all organized by A, B, C, D, you might not appreciate the power of the alphabet, but at this incredible ease and efficiency of self-organization has meant a lot of different other kinds of conveniences, right? B never comes before A, T comes after S. So this predictability gives an immense power in simply organizing libraries. You can look up anything in the dictionary, anything in the catalog, telephone directories, and even the early days of computing. So the fact that you just need to learn 26 symbols, and then you can construct any word you want in the English language, in all Indo-European languages, out of those 26 symbols, is actually remarkable. Now, if I can shift you to look at Chinese characters, there's about 80,000, depending on who you ask. Of course, not all of them are being used at any given time. And in fact, for modern day literacy, you probably need 3,000 to 5,000 characters. Still a lot compared to 26. I can tell you stories of, one of the strongest memories growing up is writing these characters over and over again. You would get anywhere between 15 to 35, 40 of them a day in school. And the bulk of your homework, at least back in the 80s, would be to just repeat them over and over again to commit them to muscle memory. So what this man did in four-corner index system was to figure out how to use characters to give them this kind of indexical function. And what he proposed was, actually, let me just hit a little bit about here, is, to put it very simply, he basically takes parts of characters, because you see that Chinese characters in a square space. So roughly you can divide it up into 4 quadrants. And you can use the corner, if you identify the contour of what the character looks like in the corner, you assign a number to it. So his idea is that, okay, then with 4 numbers, you can tag a character on all 4 sides, and that will help you zoom in and hone in on the character that you're looking for. Now, this is very important, because why else and how else would you look for characters to fish them out of, let's say, 80,000 or thousands? So he was not alone in this. There was Chen Guangyao, who wrote the Standard Radicals, Simplified Characters Index. There was Shen Zurong and Hu Qingsheng's lookup in 12 character strokes. So this is from 1920s and 1940s. There was a massive, massive race to find what's called the character retrieval system, the golden key that will unlock all these doors. And the list goes on and on. Now, Wang Yunwu was the one that's highlighted in red. But he was not the only one, although the most successful. In fact, one of the pleasures of working on this book is to basically engage with these human characters behind every Chinese character that made their preservation possible. And when you get to know them, you understand why. For instance, this man, Zhang Feng, a young man at the time, had the audacity, perhaps the vain hope, of challenging Wang Yunwu's system. Now, Wang Yunwu at the time was already a publishing maverick. He was very well connected. He claims to have been an autodidact, taught himself by reading Encyclopedia Britannica from page to page. He got up at 4 every morning, drank gallons of water, and go on like a brisk walk. So he created a lore around himself, so obviously he was also a marketing maverick. Now, Zhang Feng was this young man who obviously was very smart, and he had a great idea about tagging characters not by numbers, but by looking at its shape. And he organized a kind of simpler system this way. And so he was all but 20-some years old, and he decided he wants to challenge Wang Yunwu. And he made a mistake, one could say, in retrospect, by issuing a public challenge in a newspaper, asking him to almost like a duo. I have no idea what that would have looked like in real life. I don't know if you throw characters at each other or pieces of paper at each other. But in any case, he issued that challenge. And he did a lot. He carried his samples. He gave them to anyone he could teach it to. He really tried to publicize, but it was only one man, right? And he could not possibly defeat the entire publicity machinery that Wang Yunwu had at his fingertips, because he did something very clever, which was, at the time, he was the main editor for the biggest publishing house in China, Commercial Press, which still exists today. And Commercial Press put out all these reference works, which was actually not common prior to 20th century, but modern reference works like dictionary, thesaurus, et cetera, and to use any of them, you had to learn Wang Yunwu's four-corner system. I can tell you the four-corner system is not easy to use, and yet it still persisted when I was in graduate school at Harvard in 2000s, where you can that's still how you have to look up certain things in the old catalog system. So Wang Yunwu was quite successful. He basically did the one thing I think that would bruise any young ego. He just simply ignored Zhang Feng. And Zhang Feng pretty much fell into anonymity. But his scheme is actually one that won a lot of, I think, confirmation much later on. So what's really at stake when we talk about characters? Well, there's also the added external perception of Chinese characters that didn't really help highlight this intrinsically materialist technological challenge that it posed for the modern age. Because since the 16th, but more famously 17th century, Europeans have been fantasizing and imagining what Chinese writing was all about, right? The exotic character. Here, this is a man, Anastasius Kircher, who's very well known. He wrote this book, China Illustrata, which was published in 1667, where he shows, right, that characters written in this very ornate way. They're so in tune with nature that they're literally put together by turtles or bugs, if you can see that. You can see that below. And most Europeans who actually had not traveled abroad, did this just go out? Is it still on? Okay. Most Europeans who actually had not traveled abroad took his word for it. And he, in turn, took other people's word for it, because there were missionaries who went to China and actually tried to work with the Chinese language on the ground. But Kircher had particular imagination about what it was. And this kind of imagination or fantasy about the Chinese language will persist down to our day. But I just want to point out how powerful it was that external perception had begun this other kind of lore about the Chinese language. And I also want to say as a footnote that it turns out it was not completely Kircher's imagination. He didn't just pull this out of a hat. Because at the time, there were certain books that were translated or actually brought back to Europe, put in libraries, etc. And one of those books that we are quite sure he saw was this particular one, which is was known as a popular almanac at the time. It was almost like it's hard to describe what it is, but it's sort of for layman, popular usage, and it was sort of decorate and kind of exaggerate sort of Chinese character writing for decorative purposes largely. And so any Chinese wouldn't take this seriously as high knowledge. But of course, for Europeans who were just kind of bringing these books back, they didn't really have the context to evaluate. So what Kircher turned out, where he got it from, was simply this very popular almanac that is not really part of the Chinese language theory. But leave that as it may, this imagination persisted. How do you deal with these thousands, tens of thousands of characters? Well, in 1897, the first person who tried to put Chinese into a typewriter was this American Presbyterian missionary. So I want to accentuate the fact that this Chinese language, the technologization of Chinese language, was not just a Chinese affair. It's not just the Chinese who were concerned about it. Outsiders, foreigners, Westerners were equally concerned because they wanted a way to break into China, into its market, to win the hearts and minds of its peoples, to proselytize, to convert them, etc., etc. So Sheffield's answer was, well, kind of workmanlike. He decides, well, of course, you need to basically have a key for every character. You need to have a place for every whole character. So he put thousands on what is basically like a flat disk drum. And to find the character, so all the little dots that you see on it are actually characters, supposed to be characters. And then you sort of crank that, use that crane, and you somehow line it up with a needle on top, and then do this very laborious, it's basically like a 3-4 step process. But you can imagine a person who's doing it, it's almost like rubbing your tummy and patting your head at the same time. Because you have to rotate on one hand, but then also kind of push and pull with the other. It was very physically challenging. But Sheffield kind of meant it that way. He said, because the physical labor will teach those lazy people how to actually learn characters. He's talking about his fellow missionaries, right? That they actually have to commit characters to memory the same way that the Chinese do. But nonetheless, it was not a very imaginative solution because this was obviously cumbersome, difficult to use, even though it seemed like a giant leap forward at the time. Because this is what we're dealing with. Now, this is a keyboard tray. It's inverted, right? So you see the characters in this sort of mirror image. And each of those characters are carved into these lead slugs. And every time you want to print something, you would take out a tray, you arrange these characters to sort of just like the way you have it in the text, and then you use it to print that way. And China actually invented this technology in the 11th century, the movable type. At the time, it was kind of made of clay, not quite lead. But this technology of literally having to carve each character into a slug and then use it to type and rearrange it for a text and then do it all over again, to fish them out of a storage and then do it like over and over again. This was actually a main technique for printing up to mid-20th century. Pretty remarkable. Was it cumbersome for Chinese? Yes, but they also found a way around it such that, if you can believe it, it was faster for them to melt down everything at the end of the day and then recast the next day than it is for them to try to locate these characters, right? So the main issue really is, and Hushi had it absolutely right, how to select, retrieve, and locate characters. That was going to be key to almost everything in modernization. Because if you don't modernize your language, nothing else will be able to. So that previous image of the type, the tray of types, is actually a close-up of this typewriter. There's 3 of them in the United States, 3 existing. This one is in the Museum of Chinese America in New York City. Another one's in the Huntington Library in Pasadena. And the third one we believe is in private collection. So this is called a Shu-style Chinese typewriter, because this man Shu actually did not invent it himself, but he built it based on a model by a previous Chinese typewriter inventor after Sheffield in 1897, it was this young man, Zhou Houkun, who actually went to MIT. He's one of these first, he's actually the second class, but one of the first wave of Chinese students who were sent abroad to study MIT, Cornell, et cetera, et cetera. And he was a double major. He was the first graduate in aeronautical engineering, which was a brand new program at MIT at the time, or present-day avionics. And this was also not supposed to be his senior thesis. His senior thesis was about how to make bamboo as strong as concrete. But as with my writer, Lin Yutang, this was his passion. And he worked on this whenever he was not working on his homework. So the Shu-style Chinese typewriter works with, you see that there's a tray of slugs, right? And every time you move this, there's no keyboard. That's the important thing to bear in mind. There's a forest of keys, but no keyboard. So you can't really type it. You can only kind of locate it through, kind of like Sheffield's typewriter, which Zhou Houkun actually took a lot of inspiration from. Zhou Houkun recognized that each character would still have its own slug, its own type, that characters cannot be divided up, because he inherited this thinking, and this is true. Chinese characters traditionally there's only one part of it that can be singled out for indexable purposes, but it doesn't quite fit the purpose of modern needs. So this is the Zhou Houkun, the MIT student, and his solution to a forest of keys was basically he only had a blueprint. And we know that he built a typewriter, but he was a star MIT. He had job offers in the United States, but he decided that he would go back to China because he had thought airplanes is not what China needed now, where there's not even cars. But if you could bring back a way of printing Chinese characters, of mechanizing the Chinese language so that it can make print and literacy accessible, that would be the one measure that would be critical to China's national survival. So my favorite story about this is actually Zhou Houkun comes back. He goes back to Shanghai, where he's from, and he gives this very dramatic lecture. It was a very hot summer night in Shanghai, and they were so hot they were serving ice cream to attract more crowd. And Zhou Houkun showed up. He had this perfectly coiffed hair, Western suit. He was not, I don't think he was a terribly funny man from the way he looks. Pretty serious fellow. And he had with him a briefcase. And he carried it up to the podium with him, kind of like where I am. He puts it next to his feet. And just as everyone quieted down, he did this very odd thing. He opened up the briefcase and took out what looked like workman's overalls. And he pulled it over his suit. And he said, "Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty." And what did he mean by that? Because traditionally, manual labor was looked down upon in China. There's a reason why it's a society or civilization built on literacy and learnedness and prized learning as such. So anyone who worked with manual labor, like craftsmen, it was kind of looked at as kind of or carpentry. It's really kind of like secondary. It was more like skill, right? It was not knowledge. It's more like skill. But Zhou Houkun, having gone through an engineering program in the United States, having actually interned in factories, knew that was not the case. And to modernize, China had to strengthen engineering, mechanics, and scientific learning. And to do that, he believed, you had to correct the prejudice against kind of modernity and modernization. So it was a very successful night. Unfortunately, his efforts didn't go very far. He actually got a job at Commercial Press, the same press we were talking about, except he couldn't really quite pull it off. The parts that he required for the typewriter was too expensive, and he was so accustomed to the conditions at MIT and in the United States that he was appalled by the degree of workmanship and precision workmanship. He was very frustrated and decided he would tell Commercial Press, why don't you give me money and send me back to the United States and let me do this there. And the editor at the time, who is this classic Confucian scholar, very, very shrewd, He's like, no, we're not putting money back in the Americans' pockets. You have to do that here. But he said, you know what? Why don't you just go? We can just kind of, let you be free of our contract, free from the contract. And it's very clever because what Commercial Press did was they kept the prototype and they kept the blueprint of this typewriter. So Zhou Houkun actually ended up doing fine. You don't have to worry too much about him. But he didn't do much with his typewriter. But then Commercial Press decided, these Ivy League returnees, these Ivy League Webster educated returnees, they come back and they're spoiled and, they expect this and that. We need someone hungrier. So he found this man, Shu, a young man, who didn't get to go to America for education. And he came back and basically produced this typewriter. But still, that did not quite solve all the problems. Because you're still talking about whole characters. So we're not exactly using characters like alphabet, right? You still can't break it down like the way you can a word into letters. So you still have to deal with the sheer challenge of number and size. So amidst all these people, all these inventors and, mavericks and eccentrics, because there were many eccentrics in this race, there was another one that came to rise above everyone else. And that is, I'm happy to say, my writer, Li Yitang. Already, we see a man who I think is born to be well-bred and well-liked. And he was actually a famous humorist. He wrote essays. He became actually the most beloved and probably still to date the most well-known Chinese writer in America. He was here in the 30s and 40s. So Li Yitang came up with the idea of a clear and quick typewriter. And why is it clear and quick? He went back and looked at the Chinese character and realized that, remember I told you just a few minutes ago that Chinese characters, you can use one part it's actually called a classifier or radical to identify and to group characters. He had this idea, well, why can't you treat all parts of a character as though it were a radical? So you basically break down each character into parts, or what he called components, what came to be known as components. And once you have these components, you can lay them out, map them onto an alphabetic keyboard, right, like the QWERTY keyboard we still use. And then you can use that as a way of combining and recombining characters. So this is actually quite brilliant. Because of that turn, that shift in mentality, right? Li Yitang managed to basically map Chinese characters onto this keyboard. And what you have is I think the top 3 rows has the top components. He had this idea. Even if you don't know characters at all, if you look at like a character, surely you can tell what's on top and what's on bottom. And that's actually all you need, because he broke out these parts into top and bottoms on the keyboard so that you select a top key, you select a bottom key, you press both keys together. Okay, it's still a few more steps, but bear with me. But then you have this, what's called a magic viewer. It's like a little window, a physical window that pops up, and just through his statistical analysis, it will give you anywhere between 5 to 8 Chinese characters that fit the bill. And then you visually identify which one of those 5 or 8 is the character you have in mind. And then you press a key, which is actually where the current space bar is, where you have in your keyboard space bar. He divided that up into 8 keys, number 1 through 8. So you just press the corresponding key. So in 3 steps, you can put the character you want on a piece of paper. It's actually quite extraordinary, because also this is before, this is still the mechanical age. This is like far before electronic, let alone mechanical, or let alone digital. So this was all done with levers and pulls and maximizing what's inside the wheels and axles. It was pretty extraordinary. And this is what that keyboard looks like. This is actually from the patent application that he submitted in the late 1940s. It was approved, I believe, in 1952. Now, he gives demonstrations. Again, you can see he's very camera friendly, actually. And that's his daughter, by the way, who will go to do these demos with him. And essentially, it said the magic viewer is the one that you see where it sort of opens out to the window. It's kind of this cumbersome thing, but if you, any of you that might use Chinese characters when you type, you will also notice that these days when you type in what you want, if you spell out the Chinese character, you also get a window, right? You still can't just fish out the exact one you want. You get a window of the likely candidates, and you basically have to like scroll through. That reputedly comes from Li Yingtang's invention. But there's an even bigger deal with this, a kind of backstory. And this is how, these different histories have a way of connecting and getting forgotten and then remembered again. Now, Li Yingtang also had a similar disappointment with his typewriter because of the problem of mass scaling. So that's been the bottleneck all along. You can create a great prototype, but this comes to, okay, like how do we build thousands, hundreds, not just one or two? And he couldn't find factories that could do this. And the parts, because they all had to be customized, was very expensive. So he eventually sold it to the Mercantile Linotype Company. And they gave him $25,000 for it. Okay. But this was also 50s. This was the era of Cold War, cryptography, where machine translation, where United States and the Americans and Russians were trying to break into and intercept each other's messages, or using machine to translate, automatic translation. And the Chinese language figured a prominent role in this. So Mercantile handed it over to actually the United States Air Force, who then handed it over to IBM for further development. In the summer of 1967, I believe, I have to check that, maybe it was 63, IBM unveiled something called the Sino-Writer. It had a couple of different names, but the Sino-Writer basically used Li Yingtang's keyboard, the one you just saw, this one, to create basically a prototype that will lead to later Chinese computing in the United States. Now, this was not the only path, because there was also a project at MIT at the time with this Graphic Arts Research Foundation, GARF, based in Cambridge, that was also trying to build kind of first Chinese computer, so to speak. But they too, this man Samuel Caldwell, who people thought, I think he's been called the father of Chinese computing. He was an American. He didn't know Chinese. And what's also not very well known is that he also relied on Li Yingtang's character analysis, because when he was first called in to talk about the project, there was three people in the room. There was him, his boss, a third person who was a Chinese graduate student, PhD, who came to work with Caldwell. And he was handed the task of doing a first survey into the feasibility of doing something like this. And he basically provided all the Chinese language know-how to Caldwell. So one of the reasons I really like about this is one of the many stories that interweave through Kingdom of Characters, is really how something so niche and so esoteric and so overlooked could play such a big role in sort of globalization and the possibility of China's presence in the world now. Because getting Chinese into computing was the door that will open all other doors. And even during Cultural Revolution, the state very much recognized that. And they had to grit their teeth through, obviously, the extreme conditions of Cultural Revolution. But even throughout the Cultural Revolution, there was always individuals like Li Yingtang, like Zhou Houkun, who kept that thread going. And to me, the Chinese script revolution was the true people's revolution, right? And it's the longest, most forgotten. And it's not the people as in what is invoked by the Chinese government. It is not the people invoked by the nationalist government before that. It's really people from all walks of life. The second, third stringers of history, I like to say, who are neither radical nor really revolutionary, but they were the ones who picked up the pieces after every war, after every invasion, and to think about, they're the ones who cared and think about what China is going to be in the future. So I leave that story here, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Jing, for that absolutely fascinating talk. We have a microphone that is roving. We have a young volunteer who
Oh my goodness.
relishes.
What do I do?
I guess you just
Is that,
speak into
oh, good. So I just want to clarify, is Lin Yutang derived radicals or recognized radicals? He was the first person to recognize radicals in...
He did in a particular way in an essay in 1917. So he was a young man. No one really knew exactly who he was, really. He wrote these two very unsexy essays for the time because everybody's talking about revolution and vernacularization and overthrowing this and that. He wrote a very modest piece about library catalogs, library index system. And then after that, he actually was not part of this race in the 20s and 30s because then he went abroad. He went and got his PhD in Leipzig, Germany. He went to Harvard. He became a writer. But that opening salvo, everybody else heard it. And so a lot of the inventors in the book were the ones that kind of followed his footsteps, but then did something new with it.
Thank you. Can I throw this?
I think you can throw it back.
I think you just toss it.
Okay, next question. I'm going to toss it. Shall I toss it?
Oh my goodness.
Yes. Okay. So all of that took place before simplified characters.
I'm
were
so
codified?
glad. I'm so glad you asked that. The history of we think of simplified writing, simplified characters, and also romanization, pinyin, as the twin achievements under Mao in the 50s. But you'd be surprised to know that simplified characters were proposed way before them by the nationalists in as early as 1909. And in the 30s, the nationalists were the ones who proposed, well, they were the reigning government then, they proposed a set of characters to be simplified, but they couldn't push it through for two reasons. China was in the throes of war, right? They were just, throughout the 20th century, it was just torn by internal, like civil war, warlordism, revolution, foreign invasion, one after the other. And the other reason is because they met resistance. There were these, older members of the party who actually, the very dramatic description of one scene where one got down on his knees to tell them, leave the Chinese characters alone. For them, this is part of this difficulty in shifting a frame of mind, like a way of thinking. And they're just saying, you cannot touch anything on the character. Like the idea of deforming Chinese writing system, which is obnoxious to many and unacceptable. And also because historically, Chinese writing has always been equated with authority. There's very few writing system that comes with such a rich and kind of imposing philosophical theory about, its origin and what it meant.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks so much. I guess my question is building off that. Why the 20th century? You talk a lot about Hu Shi, right? And obviously a lot of early 20th century thinkers and their drive to kind of categorize and look into library science. And there's this focus on the character and breaking it down. And what I feel like a lot of people end up learning in Chinese class is one of the big inventions of the first emperor of China is this character system to unify all these ethnic groups and diverse cultures. So I'm kind of curious on why this drive to and this hyper focus on library science and categorization in the early 20th century rather than like earlier?
Well, this is the main argument of the book, which is because what we saw was when language became infrastructure. Because it's not, today I gave a story about Chinese typewriting and Lin Yutang because he's a writer and I'm a literature person. But a big part of the book is also about telegraphs and telegraphy. How do you expect to send a telegram in Chinese if you're using Morse code, which is dots and dashes for letters and actually numbers too, but letters, not character writing. So in the 1870s, China went through this extraordinary period of trying to figure out how to enter itself into era of telegraphy. And at that time, it couldn't take control of its fate because there was all this competition between actually the Danes and the British to break in. They had the big telegraphic companies and interest in breaking into the Far East. And so the Danes, there's this very famous episode, one moonless night, I talk about this, where they basically secretly snuck onto cables onto Chinese territory and just built it, despite the Chinese having said, no, don't do it. And there's a lot of popular revolt too against foreigners building telegraphs, because of course some of these cables go underground. And of course for Chinese this is blasphemous because they were digging through ancestral graves. And the idea that you would disturb and basically defame your ancestors that way was just utterly unacceptable. So there were popular revolts on the countryside against foreign intrusion. So telegraphy became part of foreign intrusion. But all this really is to say is started, we can trace it to the Opium War, right? That forced China to try to figure out what its standing was vis-a-vis the West. But more importantly, telegraphy, typewriting, computing, these were all critical bottlenecks in the history of what's become the most important thing of our day, which is global communications technology. So China, each step of the way, it was trying to break into this infrastructure, right? But it had to mold itself to an alphabetic structure because the Western alphabet had the first mover advantage. And it's impossible, in the history of technology, technology and science, you all learn very quickly that it's almost impossible to break a first mover's advantage. Because a classic example is QWERTY. I think most people know about the QWERTY keyboard, where it comes from. Why is it, it's ordered that way, the letters are put next to each other, so to prevent hammers from sticking, we use these really old style typewriters, which I remember my grandmother had when I was a kid. So, that's completely useless now. They're using computers. We don't use those clunky typewriters, and we haven't in a long time. But that habit is ingrained. So even though other more accessible and better keyboards came along, the Dvorak thing, it didn't really matter because people were habituated. So you can imagine how after thousands and thousands of years of using a particular writing system and to shift to figure out how do we communicate, use this sense to communicate with the alphabet. It took extraordinary determination, but also, I think, change, the willingness to change, which was very, very difficult for China to do, right? If you imagine an empire on its last legs in the late 19th century, all of a sudden it's this brave new world. They had to learn something called technology. That's why I was sending students like Zhou Houkun abroad, because they didn't have the technical know-how. So that's what unleashed all this. So we think, why did library, little did I know that when I started this project that library science would be the one thing that I spent a lot of time with, or that my favorite character in the book is actually the librarian in chapter 4, who called himself Bismarck Du, because he wanted to rule the field of library science with an iron fist. So there's these extraordinary stories, I think the individuals, because it's not often the state, the Chinese nation who's competing. It wasn't like that. China was in such disarray in the early 20th, throughout the 20th century. So much loss of lives, so much displacement. It really, that's why it's all the more remarkable that in those dark times, and there's some very dark times, what I believe kept some of these, what inspired my innovators and these individuals is precisely that, the light at the end of the tunnel. It was something they could hold on to, something they could save, right? Something they possessed because it was language. And they felt that if they do what they could, they may help one day to contribute to China's rise.
I think, as you know, Greg, it's very interesting that library science is really how Google got its start. Their first proposal to NSF was a library classification, and the search engine really came out of that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how all these loops
Yeah.
go back and forth to classification of information. It really rules the world, right, even now.
And knowledge becomes so important in our times. When you think about Wikipedia,
Right.
or how it acts like knowledge base, and the idea of linking knowledge base. If China did not make that step and get itself in the digital age, none of what it is now would be possible at all.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I was really fascinated by the Lin Yutang's typewriter method when you brought it up, and then I went through this process of thought. I was like, oh, yeah, I know what that is. Wait a minute, I don't know how to type Chinese. Well, I don't know what that is, because I used it in Korean and Japanese, but there's a different approach. Of course, you type it out phonetically first, and you don't have to, but you still use Chinese characters.
Well, now we use,
Yeah.
now we use basically alphabet letters.
Yeah, in Chinese, yeah, I've heard
But
of that.
in
I just don't know
China,
how to
like
do
you
it.
still see these keyboards, because think of it this way: if you can break down Chinese into what turns out to be 2 to 4 components, every character can be broken down to either like they get from anywhere from 2 to 4 components. That means 2 to 4 keystrokes to make a character. There are a lot of English words that are not just 4 letters, right? So in some ways you can type faster, right? Typing Chinese faster on alphabetic keyboard. So it's this remarkable, outcome of being able to harness alphabetic technology and make Chinese better, right? So instead of just becoming completely wholesale alphabetized, which China could have, it could just go with the romanization system we have now. But it's precisely because of the will, passion, devotion of people that I talk about that character writing lived on.
And I was wondering though, with Korean and Japanese, I don't know how familiar you are with like the history of this, but because they have their own challenges, of course, to making up mechanical and then computerized typewriting differently than writing in other languages. But do you know if they like all can just happen to converge on that system where like, because when I type in Korean, I type it phonetically. If I want to make a hanja, a Chinese character, it will be a numbered list, and I can like hit the number and get the one I want to sort of turn that phonetic block into a Chinese character, and similar in Japanese. Do you know if this is like they were all looking to China and this all linearly traces back to Lin Yutang, or it was just convergent evolution on like what worked best, like miraculously?
I'm glad you asked that question, because sometimes I get like grumbles from Japan knowledges who say I don't give enough credit to Japan, because Japan, of course, have been using Chinese characters as part of their 3 writing systems. And in fact, early Japanese typewriters were also used as references. But there's one critical difference, which China will make this argument again and again throughout the 20th century. Japan only has a relatively small number of characters that it uses. China only uses characters. So, it's like this classic saying, when we talk about China, size matters, right? So can it scale up technology in Japan for its own use? Not quite. It needed something more expedient, more encompassing, that's also more affordable, right? But I'm glad you brought that up, because there's definitely a lot of intra-regional quibbles that I won't tell you about now, but they're as good as that young challenger I told you about.
Does the microphone go next?
I don't think I can throw it that far.
You can throw it to an intermediary and then
Where's it going? There? There you go.
Thank you. I was really interested when you mentioned the neuroscientific differences between phonetic languages, or not alphabetic languages, and ideographic ones. And I was wondering, with pinging and more phoneticization, when you do character input and typing, does that change the way people learn Chinese and the way it's represented in the mind?
That's a very good question. I would have to refer you to the neuroscientists who may have pursued this at greater depth. I think, but what you point out is something very valid, is that we interact with writing a language differently now. It's not just, I think we're very close to bypassing keyboard, right? Because it's so much about voice input, activation, and AI technology is really going to change a lot of that. So, one might also ask whether, this entire century right, or actually 400 years of modernizing Chinese to the alphabetic infrastructure. It brought us to a point where possibly their efforts are now completely, absorbed into that progress, right?
Hi, I had a related question about neuroscience, and I wondered if there's been any studies about brain use with a character language versus a letter language, because it makes me think, people are always being told, do crossword puzzles or, all kinds of puzzles to stretch your brain. And I'm thinking someone who learns 5,000 patterns, essentially, that they can recognize, versus someone who has 26 things. It just seems like their brain, the character brain, would be stretched from the outset. And I just wondered if there was any brain science on that.
There's a couple of people that you should read. They're really I had the pleasure of consulting them both. One is Mark Changizi. You can find his book, I think, Visual Revolution. Both came out in 2010. The other one is Stanislas Dehaene, who's based in Paris. But I just have a personal anecdote to that. So when I read Chinese, I can read it very, very quickly. And a lot of times I don't read character by character at all. I can actually scan a page and kind of tell what the content is, just because that visual patterning has become so familiar to me. When I read English, I can't read it the same way. I can read it fast, but it's still kind of like, scanning fast. I can't just kind of, as they say, I can't just I can just shoot a glance at it as though I'm just shining a spotlight on the page and get like a gist of approximately what's the content, yeah. So I think there was somebody there.
I can talk loud.
No, the microphone is coming to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful, inspiring talk. I wanted to know what the emergence of this technology did to the art of handwriting, whether as an art form or on daily basis to various generations who were, I assume, as it was the case in the Middle East, that was a very pressure and beautiful art form. And we can see it in our family histories, how our writing kind of degenerated from one generation to another.
I'm so glad you asked that, because it's very common with every technological innovation. There's a lament, a nostalgia for something that's going to be lost. And it's clear that certainly, I know my handwriting has deteriorated at this age, but I think that's a very general lament that's echoed by educators around the world. But I think the digital era has also brought us something more, right? So I do think it is true that some art will be lost, just as when we look back, there are many customs and practices and art forms associated with writing that we don't even use, even like poetry. Chinese literati used to write verse whenever they see a friend. When they have drinks together, they can just dash off a verse like that. For us, it would be something you probably have to work at for 2 months, if not longer, right? So I do think those habits, technology changes with technology does change, I think, what we consider to be art. But I think it's also challenging, more importantly, what innovation means and what creativity means, right? I'm personally very interested in the idea of this new literacy provided by the Googles and the Wikipedias. Like, what does it come down to for knowledge is kind of gradually replaced by information, and that there's not a place for wisdom and experience, because everything, as in wiki in the Wikipedia, it means quick in Hawaiian, which is where it's from. Like, as in the wiki bus, if you've ever been to Hawaii and take that bus from the airport. So, we have a completely different relationship to what it means to know. It's about what's at my fingertips. What's the first to search? The first 3 things that might come up when I search for something. And I think that's actually terribly frightening, because I certainly know that as a scholar, as a humanist scholar, my greatest inspiration is to wander through stacks and find that accidental book that's kind of someone misshelved and kind of takes me on a different kind of associational process, thinking process. But now that associational process has been done for you, and they try to generate randomness into it, but that randomness, where it's almost like we're not working for it. We're just like typing it in, letting the algorithm do it. So I do think it's a kind of strange leveling process. And frankly, as a teacher, I don't know Priya feels the same. I don't know what it means for a future generation. Yeah.
The role of the individual mind, because we're all mining the collective mind at this point, right? But I had a quick question, if I may. So how did this impact? So the artistic tradition of calligraphy, was that really considered as sort of high culture and sort of a separate question, sort of insulated from all this sort of experimentation with characters?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because it also has to do with how do you preserve calligraphy, which is so highly stylized and individualized, right? It's almost like your signatures, your fingerprint. And how that would enter the digital age means how to represent it in font, right? In fonts. Now, when we talk about fonts, Helvetica, Garamond, these ones that you see. I use Calibri, I think. But you won't believe this. I mean, you might now that you've heard this talk. But in China, font design is huge. And they have managed to design these, really funky fonts all over. So much so that last year, I believe it was last year, the year before, the government issued a restriction admonishing people, because it says, these are just done by moving vectors, dragging this and that using software. It's not done through real practice of calligraphy, right? People are just randomly fattening up this character in a different, as it was done, a particular handwriting, but it's all just computer generated. So there's actually kind of, just as, China is a hyper, I think, technology friendly country, but at the same time, remember, it can do both and. It can understand the good of modernization, westernization, technology, but it also recognizes that how it got itself this far was to preserve its cultural identity and its cultural core.
And in many ways, China was, one can say, much more successful than places like India, where we have a multitude of languages, but colonialism really pushed the English alphabet. It has had its advantages in terms of Indians learning how to speak English and joining the Western world much more seamlessly. But it's interesting that the British colonial infrastructure did not get rid of sort of the Chinese. This imposition of the English, the alphabet and the language didn't have as much of success.
China watched very closely.
Yeah.
It will always cite what was happening in India, Persia, countries, civilization that lost their language when they became colonized. So you have to understand that this is still, when you hear now in the headlines, like when China accuses, towards West imperialism, American imperialism, it's not just rhetoric, right? It has basically ingrained this way of thinking that this is the one thing, right, that it must guard itself against. And it goes way back. It's not just the past 60 years.
We have time for maybe one more question, if anybody wants to ask.
Hi, Professor Xu. I have a rather technical question for about Ling Tang's typewriter. So you mentioned that you have to press two keys together for the two parts, but there's a lot of characters that don't have two parts. They're just one piece, and so how do you do with that?
So what he recognized, and thank you for that question, is that it's not so much you divide them into two parts. You need to just identify the top contour and the bottom contour. So it doesn't necessarily, it's kind of like the four corner system where you kind of identify shape. It's shape based. So it's not necessarily true that you can only share similar parts, because that would still be a very unmanageable number. But for instance, if your top part is a stroke across, many characters have that as a starting stroke, right? And same with the bottom stroke, what sort of starts it. So he actually makes it more elemental than just looking at in terms of components.
I see. Then, okay, I guess, why use top and bottom instead of left and right?
Sorry?
Why top and bottom instead of left and right?
statistically, that's how he figured it out. That is actually not what we think of as in, like 2 parts side by side, which is accounts for like top and bottom and side by side accounts for the majority shape pattern of Chinese character writing. But he figured out that the top bottom is the easiest for his
That's
purposes,
interesting.
which is all the more extraordinary, like how he arrived at this, right? Sorry? He was the first mover, but then there've been so many others. It's really a collective effort. It feels like people are indebted to him, but they have also gone beyond him. But nonetheless, yeah, that was the opening salvo.
At this point, let's thank Jing again for this fantastic talk.
Thank you for having me.